Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler turned his gaze toward a city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. It carried the name of Joseph Stalin, and that alone gave it symbolic power. But it was also industrially important and strategically placed near routes to the Caucasus oil fields. What followed became one of the deadliest and most savage battles in human history. From August 1942 to February 1943, German and Axis forces fought Soviet defenders in a landscape of shattered factories, burning apartment blocks, cellars, sewers, stairwells, and rubble. The German Luftwaffe bombed the city heavily, turning much of it into ruins. But those ruins became defensive terrain. Soviet troops used the destroyed city as a weapon, pulling the German army into close combat where tanks and air power were less decisive. The turning point came in November 1942, when the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. Instead of attacking the strongest German positions inside the city, Soviet forces struck the weaker Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies guarding the flanks. The German Sixth Army was surrounded. Hitler forbade retreat. What had begun as an offensive became a death trap. By February 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered. The German Sixth Army was destroyed. The psychological effect was enormous. Nazi Germany had suffered a catastrophic defeat, and the Soviet Union had seized the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad's casualty estimates vary, but historians widely regard it as one of the bloodiest battles ever fought. Britannica describes it as a battle of desperate house-to-house fighting, in which the German advance was stopped, while other historical estimates place total military and civilian losses at staggering levels. Its brutality lay not only in death, but in the manner of survival. Soldiers froze in trenches. Civilians hid among ruins. Food disappeared. The city itself seemed to devour armies. Stalingrad was not merely a battle. It was a furnace in which the myth of German invincibility burned away. Leningrad. If Stalingrad was a battle of fire and rubble, Leningrad was a battle of hunger. Beginning on September 8, 1941, German and Finnish forces encircled Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. The siege lasted until January 27, 1944. For nearly 2.5 years, one of the Soviet Union's great cities was cut off from normal supplies, subjected to bombardment, starvation, cold, and death on a scale almost impossible to imagine. Unlike battles decided in days or weeks, Leningrad was a slow catastrophe. The enemy did not need to storm every street. The strategy was to strangle the city. Food became the central battlefield. Bread rations fell to starvation levels. During the terrible winter of 1941 to 42, people burned furniture for warmth. Water systems failed. Bodies lay in frozen streets because the living often lacked the strength to bury the dead. The road of life across Lake Ladoga became the city's fragile artery. In winter, trucks crossed the frozen lake under German fire, bringing supplies in and evacuating civilians out. In warmer months, boats carried what they could, but the route was never enough to prevent mass suffering. The death toll remains debated. Some sources estimate hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, while others place the number at more than 1 million. Imperial War Museums notes that the siege killed over 1 million inhabitants, while World History Encyclopedia describes it as a deliberate strategy to starve a city of around 2.5 million people, resulting in roughly 1 million civilian deaths. What makes Leningrad one of history's most brutal battles is the nature of the suffering. This was not only soldiers dying under fire, it was children, elderly people, factory workers, musicians, doctors, and teachers being trapped inside a city where hunger became a daily executioner. Yet Leningrad did not surrender. Factories continued working. Artists and musicians tried to preserve culture amid catastrophe. Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, associated with the besieged city, became a symbol of resistance. The Soviet state later shaped the memory of Leningrad into a heroic legend. But behind that legend was something more terrible and more human, ordinary people enduring the nearly unendurable. Leningrad reminds us that brutality in war is not always loud. Sometimes it is silent, cold, and slow. Verdun. On February 21, 1916, German artillery opened fire near Verdun, France. The bombardment was immense. Shells tore into forts, forests, trenches, and human bodies. The German plan, associated with Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn, aimed to force France into a battle it could not abandon. Verdun was not chosen randomly. It carried deep symbolic value for France. If the French gave it up, morale might collapse. If they defended it, Germany hoped to bleed them white. The battle lasted for most of 1916, from February to December. It became one of the longest and most ferocious battles of the First World War. Britannica estimates around 400,000 French casualties and about 350,000 German casualties. Verdun was a landscape of industrialized death. Artillery dominated everything. Men lived underground in trenches, dugouts, and forts, while the world above them was pulverized. Forests vanished. Villages were destroyed so completely that some were never rebuilt. Mud, shell shock, gas, disease, and constant bombardment turned the battlefield into a mechanical slaughterhouse. One of the most haunting aspects of Verdun was its rhythm. Attack, counterattack, bombardment, replacement. Units were fed into the line, broken, withdrawn, and replaced by others. The French army rotated divisions through Verdun, meaning a vast portion of French soldiers experienced the horror of that battlefield. Fort Douaumont became one of the battle's symbols. Captured by the Germans early in the offensive, it later became a focus of French efforts to regain lost ground. But Verdun was never about one fort alone. It was about endurance. It was about whether a nation could continue absorbing punishment without breaking. The French phrase, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass, became associated with Verdun's spirit of resistance. But behind the slogan was an almost unbearable human price. Strategically, Germany failed to destroy the French army. France held Verdun, but victory came at a cost so terrible that the word Verdun became shorthand for pointless slaughter, national trauma, and the cruelty of modern war. Somme. At 7:30 in the morning on July 1, 1916, British soldiers climbed out of their trenches along the Somme River in northern France. Many had been told that the German defenses would be shattered by the massive artillery bombardment that had preceded the attack. Barbed wire would be cut, German trenches would be destroyed, machine guns would be silenced, but much of the German defensive system survived. As British troops advanced across no man's land, German machine gunners emerged from deep shelters and opened fire. Imperial War Museums describes the first day of the Somme as the bloodiest day in British military history, with more than 57,000 British casualties. The battle did not end that day. It continued for months, from July to November 1916. British, French, and German forces fought across a devastated landscape of trenches, shell holes, mud, wire, and broken villages. Losses were measured in tens of thousands. The Somme was intended partly to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and to break the German line. It did relieve some pressure, and it did inflict heavy German casualties, but it also became a symbol of the horrifying imbalance between human courage and modern defensive firepower. What makes the Somme especially brutal is the collision between expectation and reality. Many British soldiers on the first day were volunteers from PALS battalions, units formed from men of the same towns, workplaces, or communities. When these units were cut down, entire neighborhoods back home were plunged into mourning at once. The battlefield itself was an education in modern war's cruelty. Artillery could churn soil into liquid mud. Machine guns could erase waves of infantry. Barbed wire could trap men under fire. Wounded soldiers could lie for hours or days between the lines, calling for help that could not safely come. The Somme also saw the first use of tanks in battle in September 1916, though early tanks were mechanically unreliable and not yet decisive. Still, their arrival hinted at the future. War was becoming more mechanized, more industrial, and more terrifying. By the time the battle ended, the front had moved only a limited distance. The cost was immense. The Somme did not produce a clean breakthrough. It produced memory, bitter, grieving, unresolved memory. In British history, July 1st, 1916, remains one of the darkest dates of the 20th century. Okinawa. By April 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing in Europe. But in the Pacific, the war against Japan still raged with terrifying intensity. Okinawa, part of the Ryukyu Islands, became the final major battle before a possible invasion of the Japanese home islands. On April 1, 1945, more than 60,000 soldiers and Marines of the U.S. 10th Army landed on Okinawa. At first, the landing seemed deceptively easy, but Japanese forces had withdrawn into prepared inland defenses, especially in the south. There, the Americans encountered caves, ridges, tunnels, fortified positions, and deeply entrenched resistance. The battle became a grinding struggle through rain, mud, coral ridges, and shattered villages. Okinawa was brutal for soldiers on both sides. Japanese defenders often fought from caves and concealed positions, making every advance dangerous. American troops faced artillery, mortars, machine guns, mines, and kamikaze attacks against ships offshore. The psychological strain was extreme. The fighting continued for nearly 3 months. But Okinawa's deepest tragedy was civilian suffering. Okinawan civilians were trapped in the battle zone. Many died from artillery, bombardment, crossfire, starvation, disease, and mass displacement. Some were pressured or coerced by Japanese military ideology into suicide. The exact circumstances and responsibility for civilian deaths have been the subject of historical study and debate, but there is no doubt that the civilian toll was devastating. The National Museum of the Pacific War describes Okinawa as the last major battle of World War II. Okinawa mattered because it shaped what came next. The scale of casualties influenced American thinking about a potential invasion of mainland Japan. It also deepened the horror already surrounding the final phase of the Pacific War, a phase that would soon include the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan's surrender in August 1945. For Okinawans, however, the battle was not merely a military prelude. It was a civilizational rupture. Families were destroyed. Communities were uprooted. The island became a place where global strategy and local suffering collided. And those are the 5 most devastating battles in history, places where war was no longer merely a confrontation between armies, but became a horrific furnace, burning away lives, willpower, and even the fate of millions of people. Which battle left the strongest impression on you? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next fascinating history videos. For now, goodbye, and see you in the next videos.